Berlin, September 1935. Adolf Hitler announces two laws at the Nazi Party rally in Nuremberg. Within hours, hundreds of thousands of Germans who had never considered themselves Jewish are handed a document telling them their blood is impure. Some of them are wearing military medals from the last war. Some have sons about to be conscripted into the next one. Some will go on to reach the highest ranks of the Wehrmacht: generals, admirals, one field marshal. While the state that promotes them is simultaneously murdering their relatives in camps. This is the story of up to 150,000 men of partial Jewish ancestry who served in the German armed forces during World War II. Men the Nazi state classified as racially inferior and then handed rifles. Men whose faces appeared in Nazi propaganda as the ideal German soldier. Men who came home in 1945 to find that neither Germany nor the Jewish world knew what to do with them. This is what happened to the Jews who fought for Nazi Germany. Section 1. Who were these men? The Mischling Classification System, Berlin, September 15, 1935. Adolf Hitler stands before the Reichstag at the annual Nazi Party rally in Nuremberg. He announces two new laws. The crowd cheers. By the time the rally ends, Germany has a new legal definition of who is human and who is not. The laws are called the Nuremberg Laws. They do two things. First, they strip Jews of German citizenship entirely. Second, they create a new category of person, someone caught between the two worlds of German and Jewish ancestry. The Nazis call these people Mischlinge. The word means mongrel, half-breed, mixed blood. Before these laws exist, the question of who counts as Jewish has no official legal answer. The Nazi Party has been persecuting Jews since 1933 based on rough social definitions. If your family goes to synagogue, if your name sounds Jewish, if your neighbors say you are Jewish. This is chaotic. Party members argue about it constantly. Local officials make up their own rules. The result is a mess of contradictions and inconsistencies across the country. Hitler wants a clean legal framework. He wants science. He wants charts. By November 1935, the regime produces a teaching chart distributed to officials across Germany. It shows a grid. Across the top, columns represent combinations of Jewish and German grandparents. Down the side, rows show what category a person falls into depending on those combinations. The chart is color-coded. Black squares represent Jewish grandparents. White squares represent German grandparents. The combinations determine everything: whether you can vote, whether you can marry, whether you have citizenship, whether you live or die. The definitions the chart produces are as follows. A full Jew, in Nazi terminology, is anyone with 3 or 4 grandparents who were enrolled in a Jewish religious community. It does not matter what you personally believe. It does not matter if your family converted to Christianity 2 generations ago. It does not matter if you have never set foot inside a synagogue in your life. If 3 or 4 of your grandparents belong to a Jewish congregation, the state considers you Jewish. Full stop. Below the full Jews sit 2 categories of Mischlinge. A first-degree Mischling has exactly 2 Jewish grandparents. The Nazis call this person a half-Jew. Unless certain additional conditions apply, such as being married to a full Jew or being a member of a Jewish congregation when the laws came into force, this person is not classified as a full Jew. They occupy an in-between zone, not Aryan, not fully Jewish, something the Nazi state has not yet decided what to do with. A second-degree Mischling has exactly 1 Jewish grandparent. The Nazis call this person a quarter Jew. This category sits closer to the Aryan end of the chart. These people face fewer immediate restrictions, but they are still marked. They are still on the grid. The National World War II Museum records that the Nuremberg Laws, when applied across the German population, classified approximately 2,200 Germans as full Jews. On top of that, between 70,000 and 75,000 Germans were classified as first-degree Mischlinge, and between 125,000 and 130,000 as second-degree Mischlinge. The 1939 Reich census, taken 4 years later, would find approximately 72,000 first-degree Mischlinge and 39,000 second-degree Mischlinge still living inside Germany. These are not small numbers. Taken together, they represent a substantial slice of the German population. People going about their daily lives in German cities, working German jobs, attending German churches, raising German children, who now find themselves legally categorized as something other than German. Most of them did not identify as Jewish. Most had been baptized as Christians. Many had no idea that any of their grandparents had been enrolled in a Jewish congregation until the state forced them to prove their ancestry through birth records, baptismal certificates, and religious community registers. Historian Brian Mark Rigg, who conducted more than 400 interviews with Mischlinge and their relatives in the 1990s, documented this pattern repeatedly. Several of the men he interviewed had never known they had Jewish ancestry at all until Nazi racial law informed them of it. This is what makes the classification system so operationally strange. The Nazis defined Jewishness by religion, specifically by the religious community membership of your grandparents, while simultaneously insisting that Jewishness is a racial and biological condition. These two things directly contradict each other. If Jewishness is biological, it cannot be determined by which church or synagogue a great-grandparent attended. If it is determined by religious affiliation, it is not biological. The regime never resolves this contradiction. It simply applies the chart and moves on. Once a person is classified, the classification follows them into every institution in Germany, including the military. The question of Mischlinge and the armed forces does not wait until wartime. It begins almost immediately after the Nuremberg laws pass. In late 1935, Bernhard Lösener of the Reich Ministry of the Interior estimates that approximately 45,000 half-Jews of military age live in Germany. This is a significant pool of potential soldiers. Some within the Nazi leadership argue that this pool should be conscripted and used. Others argue that allowing men of partial Jewish ancestry to serve in uniform alongside pure Aryan Germans is ideologically intolerable. The debate runs for months. In April 1935, when the Reichswehr is restructured and renamed the Wehrmacht, full Jews are already being purged from its ranks, an estimated 70 personnel dismissed. But the Mischlinge question remains unresolved. On June 26, 1936, the law for the alteration of military service settles the issue. For now, first-degree Mischlinge and second-degree Mischlinge are both entitled to serve in the Wehrmacht. More than that, they are legally required to serve. Conscription applies to them the same as it applies to any other German male of military age. There is one restriction. First-degree Mischlinge are prohibited from being promoted to non-commissioned officer rank. They can fight, they can bleed, they cannot advance. There is also one critical exception. The Schutzstaffel, the SS, requires all officers to prove racial purity going back to 1750. No Mischling can serve as an SS officer. This exception will matter enormously as the war progresses, because it is the SS, not the Wehrmacht, that carries out the genocide. The men serving in Wehrmacht uniforms alongside ordinary German soldiers are, therefore, serving in a different institution from the one doing the killing, at least on paper. Whether they know what is happening to their relatives on the other side of that institutional line is a question that haunts every survivor account Rigg documents. The classification system produces something that the regime had not fully anticipated: a population of men in German uniform who are simultaneously marked for persecution by the same state that requires them to fight for it. Their families, the full Jews, the parents and siblings classified on the other side of the Nuremberg chart, are being progressively stripped of rights, of property, of citizenship, of safety, while these men are handed rifles and sent to the front. Some of them understand exactly what is happening. Some do not. Some will not allow themselves to understand, because understanding would make it impossible to function. The Mischling soldier exists at the intersection of two systems that cannot coexist: the military system that needs bodies, and the racial system that considers those same bodies impure. For as long as the military need outweighs the racial ideology, these men are protected by the uniform. When the balance shifts, the uniform stops protecting them. That shift does not happen immediately. It happens slowly, then suddenly, in stages across the war, driven by internal Nazi politics that most of these soldiers can only partially see from the outside. What the classification system creates, in practical terms, is not a coherent policy. It creates a permanent state of individual uncertainty. Every Mischling soldier knows that his status depends not on law alone, but on the decisions of individual officers, on the outcome of bureaucratic reviews he has no control over, on whether someone above him chooses to enforce the rules strictly or to look the other way because they need a competent soldier in that position. Some men seek to resolve this uncertainty proactively. They apply for exemptions. They document their battlefield records. They seek medals, because medals are documented proof of service that can be presented to a review board. They write letters to authorities requesting formal reclassification. A small number succeed. Hitler personally signs Deutschblutigkeitserklärungen, German blood certificates, for certain high-ranking or strategically valuable individuals, formally reclassifying them as Aryan by personal executive order. By Riggs' count, no fewer than 21 generals, 7 admirals, and 1 field marshal of Jewish descent serve with Hitler's direct knowledge and consent under these arrangements. The field marshal's story is its own chapter in the history of the Third Reich. It is a story about what the Nazi racial state does when ideology collides with military necessity, and military necessity wins, for a time. But below the level of the generals and the field marshals, far from the direct sight of Hitler and Himmler, there are tens of thousands of ordinary men in Wehrmacht uniforms who have no patron powerful enough to sign them a certificate, no decorated record impressive enough to override the chart, no family connection that reaches into the upper floors of the regime. They are simply on the list, first degree or second degree, enrolled in the racial grid that the Nuremberg laws drew, and they are waiting to see which way the balance tips. The classification system is only the beginning of the story. The more immediate question, one that the men themselves face in the months after September 1935, is why so many of them choose to serve or agree to serve in an army fighting for a state that has already told them they are not fully human. __quote_0__. The answer is more complicated than it appears, and it runs directly into the machinery of a system specifically designed to make refusal more dangerous than compliance. Section 2. Why did they serve? Motivation, compulsion, and the logic of survival. The question sounds simple. Why would a man fight for a country that had legally classified him as racially inferior? Why would someone pick up a rifle for a state that was simultaneously persecuting his mother, his father, his cousins, his neighbors? The answer, when you look at the actual documented evidence, is that the question itself is the wrong shape. It assumes that these men had a genuine choice. Most of them did not. Start with the law itself. On June 26, 1936, the law for the alteration of military service comes into force. The text is not ambiguous. First-degree Mischlinge, half Jews, men with 2 Jewish grandparents, are legally required to serve in the Wehrmacht. Second-degree Mischlinge, quarter Jews, men with 1 Jewish grandparent, are also required to serve. Conscription applies to them the same way it applies to every other German male of military age. This is not a voluntary program. This is not an invitation. This is a legal obligation enforced by the same state apparatus that has already demonstrated its willingness to arrest, imprison, and kill people who do not comply with its directives. Refusing conscription in Nazi Germany is not a form of protest with predictable consequences. It is an act that puts the refusing man and every member of his family directly in front of the Gestapo. When historian Brian Mark Rigg interviews more than 400 Mischlinge and their relatives in the 1990s, one of the patterns he documents most consistently is exactly this: that most of these men did not experience their military service as a political statement or an act of collaboration. They experienced it as the only available path that did not immediately destroy their families. Jakob Benecke, writing on the subject, states the logic clearly. The security that Wehrmacht service offered to Mischlinge could range from protection against anti-Semitic discrimination by the state to the basic securing of survival. Beyond that, committed service in the national community could have relieving or even life-saving effects on the close Jewish relatives of Mischlinge soldiers. The uniform, in other words, was not just protection for the man wearing it. It was a shield held up in front of the people behind him. This is the mechanism that makes the whole situation so difficult to reduce to simple moral categories. A Mischling soldier serving on the Eastern Front in 1941 is not just making a choice about himself. He is making a calculation about his mother, about his half-siblings, about whether his Jewish father survives the next Gestapo sweep. The regime understands this calculation perfectly. It is, in part, designed to produce exactly this result: to make the partial Jewish population complicit in its own suppression by giving them a narrow lane of relative safety that requires wearing a German uniform to access. But compulsion alone does not explain the full picture, because not all of these men waited to be conscripted. A significant number volunteered before they were called up. And their reasons for doing so, as documented in Riggs' research and in the individual histories that survive, are varied and specific. Some men volunteered because they were passionately German and saw no contradiction between that identity and whatever partial Jewish ancestry the state had assigned to them. These men had grown up in German households, attended German schools, served in German institutions. They had been baptized Lutheran or Catholic. They had sung German songs and celebrated German holidays. The idea that they were anything other than German had been imposed on them by a state they had not chosen, and military service was one way of asserting the identity they actually felt. Werner Goldberg is one documented example. He joins the German army on December 1st, 1938, before the war begins, and therefore before conscription of his cohort is mandatory. He is a first-degree Mischling. His father grew up in a Jewish community in Königsberg, but had himself baptized Lutheran as a young man. Goldberg knows his father has Jewish origins. He joins anyway. He participates in the invasion of Poland on September 1st, 1939. His photograph, taken sometime before or during his service, ends up on the front page of the Berliner Tageblatt with the caption, Der ideale deutsche Soldat, the ideal German soldier. The irony is complete. The face the Nazi press chooses to represent the perfect Aryan fighting man belongs to a half-Jew. Other men volunteered with more explicitly protective motivations. They had watched, over the years between 1933 and the outbreak of war, what the regime did to Jews who had no institutional protection. They had seen Jewish professionals lose their jobs under the law for the restoration of the professional civil service in April 1933. They had watched Jewish businesses get seized or destroyed. They had seen the violence of Kristallnacht in November 1938. Shops smashed, synagogues burned, men dragged away in the middle of the night. They understood that the narrow space of relative safety that existed for Mischlinge was not guaranteed. It depended on continued demonstration of loyalty to the German national community. Military service was the most visible and documented form of that demonstration available to them. Some men went further and actively sought decorations for exactly this reason. A military medal is a piece of paper signed by a German officer certifying that this man fought bravely for Germany. In a system where racial classification could be overridden by sufficiently high-ranking intervention, a documented record of battlefield courage was an argument. It was evidence to present to a review board, to place in front of an officer who had the power to sign an exemption or a German blood certificate. Several men in Riggs' research explicitly describe seeking the Iron Cross not out of ambition or patriotism, but out of calculation, because they believed it would help them survive what was coming. What was coming was not yet fully visible to most of them. That is important to understand. In 1939, when the war begins and the first wave of Mischlinge soldiers is conscripted into the Wehrmacht, the Holocaust, as it will come to be known, has not yet happened. The systematic, industrialized murder of European Jews in dedicated extermination camps does not begin until late 1941 and 1942. What exists in 1939 is persecution. Severe, violent, escalating persecution. But not yet the death camps. A Mischling soldier going to war in September 1939 is not necessarily a man who knows that his Jewish relatives are about to be murdered. He is a man who knows that his Jewish relatives are in danger, and that the uniform he is wearing is one of the few available forms of partial protection for them. Rigg documents that several of the men he interviews had visited Jewish relatives the night before those relatives were deported, not knowing at the time that deportation meant death. The full weight of what was happening was not visible to them from inside their uniforms, inside the Wehrmacht's information environment, inside the day-to-day reality of a soldier at the front. Some chose not to see it. Some genuinely did not know. Some knew and felt utterly helpless, trapped between the front they were fighting on and the fate being decided for their families behind them. The emotional landscape Rigg documents is not one of ideological enthusiasm. It is not collaboration in the sense of active support for Nazi racial policy. It is something more like what he describes as a constant, grinding emotional burden, a state of helplessness and dread that men carried alongside their rifles and their equipment through years of service. Heinz Bleicher, one of the soldiers Rigg interviews, states it directly. Few people today, he says, can understand the heavy emotional burden of partial Jews during the Third Reich. The identity crisis alone was enough to break a person. These men had grown up German. They thought of themselves as German. And then a racial chart produced in the early hours of a September morning in 1935 told them they were not quite German enough, that the country they had been raised to love had decided there was something wrong with them at the level of their blood. Most of them had not practiced Judaism. Most had never attended a synagogue. Several, as Rigg documents, had not even known they had Jewish ancestry until the Nazi racial laws forced them to examine their grandparents' certificates. The category of Mischling was, in many cases, not a description of identity that these men held about themselves. It was a description imposed on them by a state that needed a legal framework for persecution and drew the lines wherever they fell. This creates a specific psychological situation. A man who does not think of himself as Jewish, who has been raised Christian and German, who has fought in the German military, who has earned German decorations. This man has a very different relationship to the question of his service than a man who fully identifies as Jewish and is consciously aware of what his presence in a German uniform means. Both types of men exist in the documented record, but they are not the same, and treating them as the same misrepresents the actual range of human experience inside this history. There is one more dimension to the motivation question that the research makes clear, and it is the most straightforward. Some men served because the alternative was worse. Mischlinge who did not serve in the Wehrmacht, or who were discharged from service as the racial policies tightened, did not simply return to civilian life. They entered a state of progressive exposure. Without the uniform, they had no institutional protection. Without military service on their record, they had no argument to make to review boards. They became increasingly vulnerable to the expanding machinery of persecution. Labor conscription, Gestapo surveillance, deportation orders. The organization TOT, the Civil Military Engineering Corps that used forced labor on an enormous scale, was waiting for men who had no other place in the system. As the war progressed and the Wehrmacht began discharging Mischlinge soldiers, a significant portion of those discharged men ended up in organization TOT labor camps, doing dangerous physical work under conditions that, while not as immediately lethal as the concentration camps, represented a severe downgrade from the relative protection of military service. Between 10,000 and 20,000 half-Jews and persons related to Jews by marriage would end up in these units by late 1944. The men who understood this trajectory, and some of them understood it clearly, had powerful incentives to remain in uniform as long as possible, to keep their heads down, to keep earning commendations, to avoid drawing the attention of anyone who might initiate a racial review. Staying in the Wehrmacht was not loyalty to the Nazi state. For many of them, it was the most rational available survival strategy. What the documented record does not support is the idea that these men were ideological Nazis who embraced the regime's goals. Riggs' research finds no evidence of this as a predominant pattern. What it finds is a population of men caught in an impossible position, navigating a system that had been specifically designed to give them no good options, making calculations under extreme duress about how to protect themselves and the people they loved. The regime, for its part, was not unaware of what it was doing. The decision to conscript Mischlinge into the Wehrmacht while simultaneously persecuting their Jewish relatives was not an oversight or a bureaucratic contradiction that slipped through. It was a deliberate policy that produced a specific result: a large group of men who were simultaneously too useful to discard and too impure to fully include. Held in permanent institutional uncertainty, their continued protection contingent on their continued compliance. This is not a story about men who chose to fight for Nazism. It is a story about men who were placed inside a machine and forced to operate it, knowing that stopping would cost them and the people they loved everything, not knowing when or whether the machine would eventually turn on them regardless. Most of them, ultimately, it did. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The scale of what these men represented, not just as individuals but as a statistical category inside the Wehrmacht, is something that historians largely did not reckon with until Riggs' research brought it into focus in the early 2000s. The numbers are larger than almost anyone had previously understood, and the high-ranking cases among them reveal something about the Nazi state that the standard account of the regime struggles to accommodate. The most powerful case of all belongs to a man who reached the highest military rank in Germany while his father had been Jewish. A man who built the very air force that bombed London, with a German blood certificate signed by Hitler himself sitting in his files. Section 3. The scale of it. Up to 150,000 men. For decades after the war, the standard account of the Wehrmacht treated it as an institution populated entirely by ethnic Germans fighting under Nazi ideology. Jews were victims. Germans were perpetrators or bystanders. The line between those categories was understood to be clean. Brian Mark Riggs spent the better part of a decade destroying that assumption. Riggs begins his research as an undergraduate at Yale in the early 1990s. He is riding a bicycle through Germany, tracking down documents and knocking on doors. He is also in the process of researching his German ancestry, discovering something about himself: that he carries partial Jewish ancestry. The personal and the historical collapse into each other. By the time he finishes, he has conducted more than 400 interviews with Mischlinge and their relatives, worked through mountains of personnel records, and produced what military historian John Keegan calls startling and unexpected: a study that conclusively demonstrates the degree of flexibility in German policy toward the Mischlinge and the extent of Hitler's personal involvement in individual cases. The number Riggs arrives at is the one that stops people cold. Up to 150,000 men of partial Jewish ancestry served in the Wehrmacht during World War II. His estimate, cross-referenced with mathematicians and statisticians against assimilation records, birth rates, and mixed marriage rates in the German population, breaks down to approximately 60,000 first-degree Mischlinge, half Jews, and approximately 90,000 second-degree Mischlinge, quarter Jews. On top of that, a smaller but documented number of full Jews served in the Wehrmacht using false documents, their commanders believing them to be Aryan. To put that number in context, 150,000 men is roughly the size of several full Wehrmacht divisions. It is not a rounding error. It is not a handful of edge cases. It is a substantial, measurable population of men distributed across every branch of the German armed forces: the Heer, the Luftwaffe, the Kriegsmarine, fighting in every theater of the war, from the beaches of France to the frozen approaches of Moscow to the deserts of North Africa. Among them were not just ordinary soldiers. The documented record includes generals. It includes admirals. It includes at least one general feldmarschall. A field marshal, the highest military rank in the German armed forces. Around 20 soldiers of Jewish ancestry received the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross, Germany's highest military decoration for battlefield valor. These are not men who were hidden in supply depots or assigned to rear echelon duties. These are men who fought, who commanded, who were decorated by the same state that was simultaneously hunting and killing their relatives. The Wikipedia article on German Jewish military personnel of World War II, drawing on Rigg's scholarship and additional historical sources, confirms these figures and characterizes the Wehrmacht's overall policy toward Mischlinge personnel as erratic, ambivalent, and contradictory. That characterization is precise. There is no single coherent story of how the Wehrmacht treated these men because the Wehrmacht never had a single coherent policy. What it had was a shifting set of competing pressures. Military need pulling in one direction, racial ideology pulling in the other. And the men caught between those pressures were subject to whatever outcome the balance produced on any given day in any given command. The contradictions surface repeatedly in the documented record. In September 1942, the OKH, the Army High Command, issues a directive calling for the dismissal of all half-Jews remaining in the Wehrmacht. This is not the first time such a directive has been issued. Calls for the removal of Mischlinge soldiers appear repeatedly throughout the war. And yet, in the same month that the September 1942 directive goes out, the Wehrmacht simultaneously declares 118 Mischlinge soldiers and their wives to be of German blood, formally reclassifying them as Aryan, while also ruling that 258 other Mischlinge soldiers are eligible for promotion to officer rank. A directive calling for mass dismissal and individual elevations of status are being processed at the same institutional moment. This is not confusion. This is a system in which two completely incompatible priorities are being pursued simultaneously because neither side of the argument inside the Nazi leadership has enough power to fully defeat the other. The racial ideologues, led ultimately by Himmler and the SS, want all Mischlinge removed from the Wehrmacht, reclassified as Jews, and dealt with accordingly. For them, the presence of men of partial Jewish ancestry in German uniform is an ideological contamination that cannot be tolerated. The military pragmatists, officers and commanders who need competent, experienced soldiers to fight a war that is getting harder every year. Push back. They have watched the Wehrmacht bleed through its best personnel on the Eastern Front. They are not interested in dismissing trained, battle-hardened men because of their grandparents' religious community membership. As the war progresses and German casualties mount, the pragmatists gain leverage. Growing personnel shortages, as the Wikipedia record notes, allow some Mischlinge to occupy positions befitting their expertise. The war is eating men faster than ideology can sort them. But the leverage shifts. After Stalingrad in early 1943, after the surrender of the German Sixth Army and the most catastrophic defeat in Wehrmacht history, the regime does not respond to manpower shortages by moderating its racial policies. It intensifies them. The OKH begins developing proposals in 1943 for the military use of Jewish Mischlinge, who had previously been excluded from service. But the proposed use is not combat. It is forced labor in construction battalions, specifically in what the documents describe as especially unhealthy swamps. The language is a death sentence dressed in bureaucratic clothing. This is the arc of the story for most Mischlinge soldiers. Not a single dramatic moment of exclusion or persecution, but a slow, grinding tightening. More restrictions, more reviews, more directives. The space they occupy inside the Wehrmacht getting narrower every year. The protections they thought they had turning out to be contingent and revocable. The full Jews who serve do so in an even more precarious position. They are not legally permitted to serve at all. The ones who do have obtained false documents, constructed false identities, and are presenting themselves to their commanding officers as Aryan Germans. Their commanding officers, in the documented cases Rigg examines, believe them. These men are living under a false name, fighting under a false identity, in permanent terror that anyone who knew them before the war, a neighbor, a schoolmate, a family acquaintance, might recognize them and report them. The Warfare History Network article on Rigg's research confirms that probably several thousand full Jews served in the Wehrmacht this way. The exact number cannot be established because these men, by definition, left no official record of their true identity. What drives a full Jew to this extreme? The same logic that drives everything else in this story. The calculation that the risk of this particular exposure is less than the risk of all the other available options. A Jewish man in Germany in 1939 who has no documents, no exemption, no Aryan wife, and no powerful patron faces deportation, forced labor, or worse. A Jewish man in Germany in 1939 who has forged documents and a Wehrmacht uniform has at least a fighting chance. Literally. The distribution of Mischlinge across ranks and roles within the Wehrmacht is itself significant. These men are not all concentrated at the bottom. The documented record includes figures at every level of the military hierarchy, up to and including the very top. Riggs' research identifies no fewer than 21 generals of Jewish descent who served with Hitler's direct knowledge and consent, 7 admirals, 1 field marshal. These are not men who slipped through the system unnoticed. These are men whose ancestry was known, investigated, and in many cases personally reviewed by Hitler himself, who chose to issue formal exemptions allowing them to continue serving. The mechanism for these exemptions is the Deutsche Blutigkeitserklärung, the German blood certificate. Hitler signs these documents personally for individuals he considers sufficiently valuable or sufficiently trustworthy. The certificate formally reclassifies the recipient as a person of German blood, overriding their Mischling status for all legal purposes. It does not change the facts of their ancestry. It changes what the facts officially mean. The Nazi racial state, which insists that race is a biological and permanent reality, is simultaneously running a paperwork system that allows the Führer to change a person's race with his signature. The most senior recipient of this arrangement, the man whose case most completely exposes the internal contradiction of the entire system, is the Luftwaffe's second-in-command. But before that specific story, it is worth pausing on what the aggregate picture means. 150,000 men, generals and privates, decorated veterans and reluctant conscripts, men who volunteered to prove their Germanness, and men who were handed rifles because the law said they had to be. Men who knew exactly what was happening to their Jewish relatives, and men who would not find out until after the war. Men who tried to use their military records to protect their families, and men who discovered too late that the uniform offered no protection at all. Former German Chancellor Helmut Schmidt, himself a Wehrmacht veteran, reviewed Riggs' research before publication and wrote that Riggs' in-depth treatment of the subject of German soldiers of Jewish descent in the Wehrmacht would lead to new perspectives on this portion of 20th century German military history. Schmidt was not wrong. The perspectives it leads to are uncomfortable in every direction. For those who want a clean narrative of the Wehrmacht as a purely Aryan institution fighting a racial war, the 150,000 destroy it. For those who want a clean narrative of the Mischlinge as straightforward victims who had nothing to do with the German war machine, the 150,000 also destroy it. What the research produces instead is a picture of extreme human complexity under conditions of extreme state violence. People making calculations they should never have been forced to make, inside a system specifically designed to leave them no good options. Michael Berenbaum, one of the foremost Holocaust scholars in the world and author of The World Must Know, wrote in response to Riggs' work that the study conclusively demonstrates the extent of Hitler's involvement, and most importantly, that not all who served in the armed forces were anti-Semitic, even as their service aided the killing process. That last clause is the one that does not resolve. Their service aided the killing process. Whatever their intentions, whatever their calculations, whatever their private grief, the institution they were part of was the institution carrying out the war that made the Holocaust possible. The decorated Knight's Cross recipients among them fought in campaigns that occupied the countries where Jews were then rounded up and shot. The generals signed orders that moved armies across territories where Einsatzgruppen were operating behind the front lines. The ordinary soldiers held the line that kept the Reich intact while the death camps processed their relatives. None of this means these men were Nazis. The documented record does not support that conclusion. What it means is that the situation the Nazi state engineered was specifically designed to make clean moral categories impossible. To implicate everyone. to make the partial Jewish population complicit in the machinery of the state by giving them a narrow lane of survival that required participation. The Knight's Cross recipients, the generals, the admirals, the field marshal at the top, these are the visible peak of the 150,000. They are the cases dramatic enough to be individually documented and remembered. But the 150,000 is mostly made up of men nobody remembers. Ordinary soldiers with ordinary roles, navigating the same impossible situation without the protection of rank or decoration, or a personal exemption signed by Hitler. Their individual stories largely did not survive. What survived is the number, and the number is large enough to change what we think we know about what the Wehrmacht was. __quote _2, __. The single most dramatic individual case within that number belongs to a man who never had to fight for his position the way ordinary Mischlinge soldiers did. He had something they did not. A patron at the very top of the Luftwaffe who was willing to do whatever was necessary to keep him in place. What that patron did, and what it reveals about how the Nazi racial state actually operated behind its public ideology, is a story that begins with a rumor, moves through a Gestapo investigation, and ends with a field marshal's baton being broken over its owner's head by a British commando who had just walked out of Bergen-Belsen. Section 4. The man Hitler Aryanized. Field Marshal Erhard Milch, Wilhelmshaven, Germany. March 30th, 1892. A boy is born to Anton Milch, a Jewish pharmacist serving in the Imperial German Navy, and his wife Clara, whose maiden name was Rosenau. They name the boy Erhard. He grows up in a naval town, the son of a man who serves the German state in uniform. He will spend his entire adult life doing the same thing. He will rise higher than almost any other German officer of his generation. And the fact of his father's ancestry will follow him like a shadow across 4 decades, from the early days of the Weimar Republic to a courtroom in Nuremberg where American prosecutors will question him about it, while the ruins of the regime he helped build are still smoldering outside. Erhard Milch enlists in the Imperial German Army in 1910. He serves as an artillery officer, rises to the rank of lieutenant, and transfers to the Luftstreitkräfte, the Imperial Air Force, where he trains as an aerial observer. By the closing months of World War I, he is commanding a fighter wing, Jagdgruppe 6, as a captain. When the war ends and Germany collapses, he resigns from the military in 1920 and moves into civil aviation. What follows is a decade of building. Milch is not a visionary in the romantic sense. He is an organizer, a logistics man, someone who understands how large systems work and how to make them work better. He takes over a small airline company in Danzig. Then he moves to Junkers Luftverkehr. Then he oversees its merger with another carrier to create Deutsche Lufthansa in 1926, becoming its first managing director. By the time Adolf Hitler is appointed Chancellor of Germany in January 1933, Erhard Milch is the most important figure in German civil aviation. And he's about to become the most important figure in German military aviation. Hermann Göring needs him. Göring has been tasked with building the Luftwaffe, a German air force that officially does not exist yet because the Treaty of Versailles prohibits Germany from having one. The construction of this air force is one of the central projects of the new Nazi regime, and it requires someone who knows how aircraft production works, how supply chains are organized, how an aviation industry is built from the ground up. Göring knows exactly who that person is. Hitler meets with Milch personally. The conversation, as Milch records it in his diary, is direct. Hitler tells him that Germany needs him, that this is not a question of party politics, but a question of Germany itself, and that the choice has fallen on him. Milch takes the job. In 1933, he becomes state secretary in the newly formed Reichsluftfahrtministerium, the Reich Aviation Ministry, reporting directly to Göring. His responsibility is the organization and development of what will become the most feared air force in Europe. There is, from the beginning, a problem. Anton Milch, Erhard's legal father, is Jewish. Under the Nuremberg laws that will be passed in 1935, this makes Erhard Milch a first-degree Mischling. a half-Jew. Under the racial framework of the state he is now helping to build, he is not a German citizen in full standing. He is racially impure. He should not, by the logic of the system, be holding one of the most powerful positions in the German military-industrial apparatus. For 2 years after he takes the job, this fact sits beneath the surface. Milch is too valuable, too embedded, too central to the project of building the Luftwaffe for anyone with real power to want to disturb the arrangement. But in 1935, the Gestapo opens an investigation. Rumors have begun to circulate. Someone has talked. The investigation is formal and official. The same machinery that is being used across Germany to trace the ancestry of hundreds of thousands of citizens is now being pointed at the second most powerful man in the German Air Force. Göring moves fast. What Göring produces is an affidavit signed by Milch's mother, Clara. The affidavit states that Anton Milch is not actually the biological father of Erhard and his siblings. Clara claims in this document that the true biological father of her children is her own uncle, a man named Karl Brauer, who died in 1906. The logic is straightforward in its brutality. If Karl Brauer, a non-Jewish German, is Erhard's real father, then Erhard has no Jewish parent at all. He is not a Mischling. The legal paternity of Anton Milch is never formally changed. The birth records still show Anton as the father. But the affidavit exists, Göring presents it to the relevant authorities, and the Gestapo investigation stops. What Clara Milch actually sacrifices to produce this document is considerable. She declares in a legal affidavit that she committed adultery with her own uncle. She damages her own reputation and her deceased husband's reputation to protect her son's career. Without this act, Erhard Milch almost certainly loses his position. With it, he is issued a Deutsche Blutigkeitserklärung, a German blood certificate, and formally reclassified as a person of German blood. Adolf Hitler signs the certificate personally. The background to all of this produces one of the most quoted lines in the history of the Third Reich. Hermann Göring, confronted with questions about Milch's ancestry, declares, "Wer Jude ist, bestimme ich." I decide who is a Jew. The line is attributed to Göring in the context of the Milch case, and it captures with perfect clarity something that the Nazi racial state preferred not to say out loud: that racial classification was not a scientific process, but a political one. That the chart with its black and white squares could be overridden whenever the person holding sufficient power decided that overriding it served their interests. With his Jewish problem officially resolved on paper, Milch goes to work. What he builds over the following years is the Luftwaffe that bombs Warsaw, Rotterdam, and London. He is not flying the planes. He is building the system that produces them, maintains them, fuels them, and replaces them when they are shot down. As State Secretary of the Aviation Ministry, he is responsible for armament production. When war breaks out in September 1939, he commands Luftflotte 5 during Operation Weserübung, the invasion of Norway. After the fall of France in June 1940, he's promoted to General Feldmarschall at the Field Marshal ceremony, one of a cohort of senior officers elevated simultaneously by Hitler in recognition of the French campaign. He is now a Field Marshal, the highest military rank in Germany. In November 1941, the Luftwaffe's Chief of Research and Development, Ernst Udet, kills himself. The pressures of the job and his deteriorating relationship with Göring have broken him. Milch steps into the role of General Luftzeugmeister, responsible for all Luftwaffe aircraft production, armament, and supply. He's now running the entire industrial apparatus that keeps the German Air Force in the air. Under his direction, the Luftwaffe's production operation is reorganized and expanded. Monthly aircraft production rises from approximately 1,000 units in early 1942 to peaks exceeding 3,000 by late 1944. He achieves this through factory dispersal, subcontractor networks, and forcing assembly line techniques on manufacturers who resist them. The numbers are real and documented. The methods he uses to achieve them are also real and documented. And they are where the story of Erhard Milch becomes something other than a story about racial irony. By mid-1942, Milch is coordinating with Fritz Sauckel, the Nazi plenipotentiary for the allocation of labor, to secure hundreds of thousands of foreign workers for assignment to aviation factories. Messerschmitt, Junkers, Heinkel. The workers being secured are not volunteers. They are Eastern Europeans, Soviet prisoners of war, and concentration camp inmates transported under brutal conditions to work in German factories. By 1943, forced laborers comprise up to 40% of the workforce in key German aircraft plants. Milch's office requests specific quotas, documented in his 1947 trial records, including 40,000 Soviet prisoners of war for engine and airframe production in 1942. He directly approves the deployment of concentration camp inmates in Luftwaffe contracted facilities. The man whose mother signed an affidavit to save him from the racial laws is running a production system that uses the same racial laws to work other people to death. In April 1942, Milch is named to the Central Planning Board alongside Albert Speer, Paul Kerner, and Walter Funk, coordinating control over the entire German industrial war economy. He is at the center of the machine. The personal relationships that sustained him begin to break down in 1944. Milch sides with Joseph Goebbels and Heinrich Himmler in attempting to convince Hitler to remove Göring from command of the Luftwaffe. The man who had saved him in 1935, who had produced the affidavit, who had declared himself the arbiter of Jewish identity to protect his subordinate's career. Hitler refuses. Göring retaliates by forcing Milch out of his position as director of air armament. For the final months of the war, Milch works under Albert Speer, diminished and sidelined. On April 30th, 1945, Hitler kills himself in the Berlin bunker. Germany's unconditional surrender follows on May 7th and 8th. Milch attempts to flee toward the Baltic coast. He is captured on May 4th, 1945, near Lech, Germany, by British commando forces under Brigadier Derek Mills Roberts, commander of the 2nd Special Air Service Regiment. Mills Roberts has just come from Bergen-Belsen. He has walked through what the liberation of that concentration camp looked like. The mass graves, the survivors who weigh nothing, the smell. When Milch presents his field marshal's baton upon surrendering, Mills Roberts takes it and breaks it over Milch's head. The symbolism is not subtle. A field marshal's baton, broken over the head of a man whose Jewish father's name is on his birth certificate, by a soldier who has just witnessed what the regime that baton represents did to Jewish people. Mills Roberts is not subsequently disciplined in any meaningful way. His superior, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, is reportedly told about the incident and responds with something close to indifference. In 1947, Milch is tried by a United States military tribunal in Nuremberg. The charges are war crimes and crimes against humanity. He is convicted on both counts for his participation in the murder, enslavement, deportation, and torture of civilians and prisoners of war, and for his central role in the forced labor system that ran through the Luftwaffe's production apparatus. He is sentenced to life imprisonment at Landsberg Prison in Bavaria. The sentence is later commuted. He is released in 1954. He lives until January 25, 1972, dying in West Germany at the age of 79. During the Nuremberg trials in 1946, American Chief Prosecutor Robert H. Jackson questions Milch directly about his ancestry and about Göring's role in the matter. The whole episode, the affidavit, the German blood certificate, the famous line about deciding who is a Jew, is laid out in a courtroom for the public record. Milch, by some accounts, has a mental breakdown when the full details are exposed. The Milch case is the extreme end of a spectrum. It shows what happened when a Mischling had a powerful enough patron and was valuable enough to the regime that the racial laws were simply set aside by executive fiat. But it also shows the limits of that protection. It did not make Milch safe from internal regime politics. It did not protect him from the judgment of history, and it did not change what he had become in the process of navigating the system. His mother had saved his career by declaring herself an adulterer to protect a son who went on to build the production system that bombed European cities and worked thousands of forced laborers to death. Whatever she imagined when she signed that affidavit, it was almost certainly not that. The Milch case is exceptional because of the rank involved and the directness of Hitler's personal intervention. But the mechanism it illustrates, racial classification overridden by political convenience, the German blood certificate as a tool for managing ideological contradictions, operates at every level of the Wehrmacht hierarchy. It operates most intensely at the top, where the stakes are highest and the patrons are most powerful. And it produces, in the documented record, a question that the Nazi state never successfully answers at any level, from the field marshal down to the ordinary private. When does a Mischling soldier stop being useful enough to protect and start being Jewish enough to destroy? The answer to that question is not determined by law. It is determined by the war. And as the war turns against Germany in the years after Stalingrad, the answer shifts in one direction only, toward the men who had been serving in German uniform, discovering that the uniform was running out of protection to offer them. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. What happens to those men, the ones without Göring's patronage, without Hitler's signature, without a German blood certificate? When the policy machine finally turns its full attention toward them, is written into the minutes of a conference held in a villa on a frozen January morning in 1942, where 15 men sat around a table and debated, over cognac, what to do with the half-Jews in their midst. Section 5. The Policy Machine. Erratic, shifting, and contradictory. Am Großen Wannsee, 56-58. Berlin, January 20th, 1942. The villa sits beside a lake in one of the wealthiest suburbs in the city. It was built in 1915, passed through several owners, was seized by the SS, and converted into a guest house for senior Nazi officers. On this particular Tuesday morning in January, 15 men gather inside it. 8 of them hold doctoral degrees. All of them hold positions of significant power inside the Nazi state. They have been called together by Reinhard Heydrich, chief of the Reich Security Main Office, to discuss the coordination of what the Nazi leadership calls the final solution to the Jewish question. The meeting lasts 90 minutes. Most of the agenda concerns the logistics of deporting and murdering the Jews of Europe, a process that is already underway, with mobile killing units having shot approximately 900,000 Soviet Jews by the end of 1941, and the first extermination camp at Chelmno having begun operations in December of that year. Heydrich is not announcing a new policy at Wannsee. He is coordinating the bureaucratic machinery to implement a policy already decided at the highest level. But a significant portion of the meeting, the portion that produces the most animated discussion among the 15 men present, is about something else. It is about the Mischlinge. The question on the table is straightforward in its horror. What do you do with the hundreds of thousands of people sitting between the category of full Jew and full Aryan? What do you do specifically with the men currently serving in Wehrmacht uniform whose grandparents were Jewish? Heydrich comes in with a position. He wants first-degree Mischlinge, half-Jews, men with 2 Jewish grandparents, treated as full Jews. In practical terms, this means deportation. In 1942, deportation means death. He proposes an exception for first-degree Mischlinge who are married to non-Jews and have children from that marriage, and for those who have been granted written exemptions by the highest offices of the party and state. Everyone else in the first-degree category under Heydrich's proposal goes east. The room does not simply agree. Wilhelm Stuckart, State Secretary of the Reich Ministry of the Interior, pushes back. Not because he objects to the persecution of Mischlinge. He does not. But because he argues that mass deportation of first-degree Mischlinge will create administrative chaos. These people are embedded in German society. They have non-Jewish spouses, non-Jewish children, non-Jewish neighbors and colleagues and employers. Deporting them will generate paperwork, protests, and complications that the regime does not need in the middle of a war. Stuckart's counterproposal is compulsory sterilization. Sterilize all first-degree Mischlinge. They can remain in Germany. They can keep their lives. But they cannot produce children. Within a generation, the problem, as Stuckart frames it, resolves itself biologically. SS General Otto Hoffmann, head of the SS Race and Settlement Main Office, offers a third option. Give first-degree Mischlinge a choice between deportation and voluntary sterilization. The Wannsee Protocol, the official minutes of the meeting prepared by Adolf Eichmann and circulated among participants afterward, records all of this in the flat, bureaucratic language the Nazi state uses to discuss mass murder. The document is genuine. It survives the war. It is now held at the house of the Wannsee Conference Memorial and Educational Site in Berlin, and a full transcription is available through Yad Vashem. What the protocol records is that no final decision is reached on the Mischlinge question at Wannsee. The debate is deferred. 2 further conferences are held, one in March 1942, one in October 1942, specifically to continue the discussion. These conferences also failed to produce a definitive resolution. The National World War II Museum, in its analysis of the Wannsee Conference, identifies this failure directly. The Nazi dictatorship, it notes, never definitively settled on a policy for Mischlinge throughout the remainder of the war. The Traces of War historical reference confirms that in October 1943, an agreement was ultimately reached between the Ministry of Justice and the SS not to deport German Mischlinge during the war. That agreement, reached nearly 2 years after Wannsee, is what saves the majority of Mischlinge from the fate that Heydrich proposed for them in January 1942. Not moral objection, not humanitarian concern, an administrative compromise between 2 competing bureaucracies that could not agree on the logistics of persecution. The failure to resolve the Mischlinge question at Wannsee is not incidental to the history of what happens to Jewish soldiers in the Wehrmacht. It is the central fact that shapes their experience for the remainder of the war. Because the regime cannot decide what to do with them as a category, it deals with them as individuals, through reviews, through exemptions, through directives that contradict each other, through the personal decisions of individual officers and officials at every level of the hierarchy. The result is the pattern that the Wikipedia article on German Jewish military personnel describes with precision: erratic, ambivalent, and contradictory. Look at the sequence of directives and counter-directives across the war years, and the pattern becomes visible. In 1934, the Reichswehr, the predecessor to the Wehrmacht, purges full Jews from its ranks. Approximately 70 personnel are dismissed. The action is limited to full Jews. Mischlinge are not yet specifically targeted. In April 1935, when the Reichswehr is restructured into the Wehrmacht, debate begins about whether Mischlinge should be conscripted. Some argue yes, others argue no. The debate runs for over a year. In June 1936, the law for the alteration of military service resolves the debate by requiring Mischlinge to serve. They are in, but they cannot be promoted to NCO rank. The inclusion is partial, conditional, laced with restriction from the beginning. By 1938 and 1939, as the war approaches and then begins, thousands of Mischlinge are conscripted. They go to Poland, to France, to North Africa, to the Soviet Union. They fight, they bleed, they are decorated in some cases and overlooked in others. In September 1942, 3 years into the war, with Germany deep inside the Soviet Union and the Battle of Stalingrad approaching its catastrophic conclusion, the OKH issues a directive calling for the dismissal of all remaining half-Jews from the Wehrmacht. And simultaneously, in the same month, 118 Mischlinge soldiers and their wives are declared to be of German blood. Another 258 Mischlinge soldiers are declared eligible for promotion to officer rank. The left hand and the right hand of the same bureaucracy are pulling in opposite directions. In 1943, after Stalingrad, the OKH begins developing proposals not to discharge Mischlinge, but to use the ones previously excluded from service in forced labor battalions in especially unhealthy swamps. The language is from the actual documents. The proposal represents a significant shift in how these men are being conceptualized by the military bureaucracy. No longer as soldiers, not yet as condemned prisoners, but as a labor resource to be consumed in dangerous conditions. By late 1944, between 10,000 and 20,000 half-Jews and persons related to Jews by marriage are being conscripted into special organization-taught units. The organization TOT is the civil military engineering corps that has been using forced labor since the late 1930s. By 1944, it is running more than 100 forced labor camps. The Mischlinge arriving in these camps are not there as soldiers. They are there as workers, under conditions that are significantly worse than Wehrmacht service, and significantly better, for now, than the concentration camps. An academic study documented on academia.edu and based on survivor testimonies identifies that more than 20,000 Mischlinge and Jews in mixed marriages face forced labor in these organization TOT camps in 1944 and 1945. The conditions vary between camps. Some inmates face malnutrition. Some face harsh physical treatment. Many are prohibited from leaving campgrounds and have limited correspondence rights. Families and former employers sometimes attempt to have specific individuals released, and in some cases succeed. A measure of the degree to which these men still exist partially in the civilian social world, unlike the inmates of the SS-run concentration camp system. The same study notes something specific about how previous military service affects treatment inside these camps. Men who had served in the Wehrmacht and could demonstrate it. Men who carried their military records and in some cases their decorations, received slightly better treatment from camp guards than men who could not. Former Mischlinge soldiers in at least one documented camp, Mittitzreutchen, explicitly request permission to wear their military decorations while performing forced labor. The Iron Cross, the Eastern Front Medal, the decorations they had earned fighting for Germany. In 1944, they are presenting these objects to camp guards as evidence that they deserve to be treated with some residual measure of human dignity. The individual case of Colonel Ernst Bloch captures the mechanism of the late war persecution in a single documented moment. On September 15, 1944, as Allied armies pressed Germany from both east and west, an officer in Himmler's headquarters writes to General Major Wilhelm Burgdorf, deputy chief of the Wehrmacht Personnel Office, demanding the dismissal of Bloch from the army. Not because Bloch has failed as a soldier, not because of any military deficiency, because he is a Mischling. His father is Jewish. Himmler wants him out. Bloch has served throughout the war. He has a record. He has survived years of the Wehrmacht's shifting policies toward Mischlinge, has presumably navigated review boards and racial audits, and the periodic directives calling for the dismissal of men like him. By September 1944, the war is clearly lost. Germany is being compressed from every direction. The Wehrmacht needs experienced officers, and Himmler's office is processing paperwork to remove a colonel because of his father's ancestry. This is what the policy machine looks like at its most nakedly absurd. The racial ideology and the military reality have been in tension for the entire war. By September 1944, the racial ideology is still generating paperwork, even as the military reality is collapsing around it. The Bloch case is documented in Riggs research and in the Warfare History Network article drawn from that research. What ultimately happens to Bloch in the final months of the war is not fully established in the public record. What is established is the moment. An officer in Himmler's headquarters writing a letter in September 1944 to get a colonel fired for being half Jewish. The Werner Goldberg case offers a different angle on the same policy chaos. Goldberg, whose photograph has been used by the Nazi press as the face of the ideal German soldier, serves through the invasion of Poland. His Mischling status is known. It is, in fact, the irony that makes his story documentable. The regime that publishes his face as racial propaganda knows he is a half-Jew. This does not stop the publication. The propaganda machine and the racial classification machine operate on different tracks, producing contradictions that neither bothers to resolve. The broader picture that emerges from all of this is of a state whose racial ideology was always, in practice, subordinate to other pressures. Military need, administrative convenience, personal patronage, the competing interests of different bureaucratic empires. The SS, the Wehrmacht, the Ministry of the Interior, the Party Chancellery. These are not a unified machine, all pulling in the same direction. They are competing institutions with different priorities, using the racial laws as a tool for advancing their own power as much as for implementing any coherent ideological program. For the Mischlinge soldiers caught inside this system, the practical consequence of all this institutional chaos is a form of permanent uncertainty that functions as its own kind of persecution. They cannot know, from one month to the next, whether the current directive will be enforced against them, whether a review board will decide their case favorably or unfavorably, whether the officer above them is inclined to protect them or to use their ancestry against them. The protection they have is not a right. It is a contingency. It depends on forces entirely outside their control. What is remarkable, in retrospect, is how many of them survive. The failure of the Nazi bureaucracy to resolve the Mischlinge question definitively, the endless conferences, the competing proposals, the October 1943 agreement not to deport during wartime, creates a space in which most first-degree Mischlinge in Germany survive the war without being sent to the extermination camps. Not because the regime decides to spare them, because the regime cannot agree on what to do with them and runs out of time before it can. That survival, however, does not mean the end of persecution. It does not mean safety, and it certainly does not mean that what comes after the war is simple. The men who survive their Wehrmacht service and emerge from the organization-taught camps in 1945 walk into a post-war world that does not know what to do with them any more than the Nazi state did. A world in which the community that might have claimed them had been largely destroyed, and the community they had served did not want to acknowledge what their service had actually looked like from the inside. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. What that reckoning looks like. For the ordinary soldiers, for Werner Goldberg in his West Berlin parliament seat, for the men who carry their iron crosses into forced labor camps and out the other side, is inseparable from the question of what happened at Wannsee and what the policy machine produced in the years that followed. But it is also inseparable from something more immediate and more personal. The specific moment, different for every man, when the Wehrmacht uniform stopped being protection and started being the last thing standing between him and the same fate as his relatives. Section 6. Werner Goldberg, the ideal German soldier who was half Jewish Berlin. Late 1938. A young man named Werner Goldberg is working as an apprentice at a clothing company called Schneller und Schmeider. He is 19 years old. Several of his colleagues at the company are Jews or Mischlinge. He knows this because he is one of them. His father, a man named Goldberg Sr., grew up in Königsberg as a member of the Jewish community. He had himself baptized Lutheran as a young man because he wanted to assimilate, wanted to marry a Christian woman, wanted to be German in the fullest sense available to him. Werner and his brother Martin are baptized in the Grunewald Lutheran Church in Berlin at their father's request. They grow up Christian. They grow up German. Werner does not know his father has Jewish origins until he is a student at the Grunewald Gymnasium in Berlin and is suddenly, without warning, ostracized by his classmates. He does not understand why at first. Then the understanding arrives, and it does not leave. In 1935, the school becomes what the Nazis call Jew-free. Werner leaves. He is 16 years old. The country he has been raised to consider his own has decided there is something wrong with him. His maternal uncle joins the Nazi Party. The uncle refuses to be seen with the Goldberg family in public. He will not acknowledge Werner's mother, his own sister, in social situations. The family contracts around the absence he creates. In early 1938, Werner serves a 6-month term in the Reich Labor Service, the compulsory work program that precedes military service for German men. The uniform he wears has a swastika on the armband. On December 1st, 1938, 6 weeks after Kristallnacht, in which Jewish-owned businesses across Germany have been smashed and burned, and Jewish men have been dragged from their homes and sent to concentration camps, Werner Goldberg joins the German army. He is not yet conscripted. He volunteers. He is 18 years old. He is a first-degree Mischling, and he enlists. His reasons are not recorded in any single document. What is recorded is the pattern that historian Brian Mark Rigg documents across hundreds of similar cases. The calculation that active, visible military service is one of the few available forms of protection in a state that is systematically removing every other form of safety from people classified as Mischlinge. Werner's father has already lost his position under the law for the restoration of the professional civil service. The April 1933 law that expelled Jews and those of Jewish descent from the German civil service. The family knows what the trajectory of persecution looks like. The uniform is a shield. On September 1, 1939, Germany invades Poland. Werner Goldberg is there. He serves alongside his childhood friend Karl Wolff, whose father is by now a high-ranking SS officer. The two men, one half Jewish, one connected to the upper ranks of the organization carrying out the persecution of Jews, fight in the same campaign, in the same army, for the same state. Somewhere during this period, a photograph is taken of Werner Goldberg. The photograph shows a young man in Wehrmacht uniform. He has light features. He looks by the aesthetic standards the Nazi regime has spent years promoting, like what the regime wants its soldiers to look like. The photograph ends up in the editorial offices of the Berliner Tageblatt, one of Berlin's major newspapers. It is published in the Sunday edition. The caption reads, Der ideale deutsche Soldat, the ideal German soldier. The face the Nazi propaganda apparatus selects to represent the perfect Aryan fighting man belongs to a half-Jew whose father grew up in the Jewish community of Königsberg. The irony is total. It is also, in the context of the Michelin classification system, entirely explicable. The system does not work the way the ideology says it works. The ideology says Jewish blood is visible, detectable, expressed in physical appearance and behavior. The reality is that Werner Goldberg looks like the propaganda poster. The ideology and the reality do not match, and the propaganda apparatus does not notice the gap because it has no mechanism for noticing it. Whether the editors of the Berliner Tageblatt know that their ideal German soldier is a first-degree Mischling is not established in the historical record. What is established is that the photograph is published, and that it becomes one of the most discussed images in the subsequent historiography of the Mischling question. Documented in the Wikipedia article on Werner Goldberg, referenced in Brian Mark Rigg's research, and featured in the 2006 documentary Hitler's Jewish Soldiers, produced by Larry Price in association with the Israel Broadcasting Authority. The documentary film draws heavily on Rigg's foundational 2002 book and focuses on specific individual cases, with Goldberg as one of its central subjects. His story functions in the documentary as an entry point into the broader phenomenon precisely because the photograph makes the contradiction so visible and so complete. You do not need to read the Nuremberg laws to understand what the photograph means. You just need to know who is in it. Goldberg also appears in an episode of the Yesterday television series called Nazi Collaborators, in a segment titled The Jews Who Fought for Hitler, first broadcast in the United Kingdom in December 2010. The framing of that title, Jews Who Fought for Hitler, captures the surface-level paradox while obscuring the more complex reality. Goldberg did not think of himself as Jewish. He had been baptized Lutheran. He had been raised in a German household by a father who had spent his adult life trying to assimilate completely into German society. The category of Jew had been imposed on him by a racial classification system he had no part in creating. This distinction matters not as an excuse, but as a fact. The men in this history are not best understood through the lens of the choices they made. They are best understood through the lens of the system that structured those choices, that made some options available and others impossible, that handed Werner Goldberg a rifle and a uniform while simultaneously persecuting his father, that published his face as a racial ideal, while its racial laws classified him as impure. Goldberg survives the war. He survives the Wehrmacht. He survives the years of shifting policy and escalating persecution that follows other Mischlinge through the labor camps and the organization-taught units and the endless bureaucratic reviews. What he does after the war is, in its own way, as telling as the photograph. He joins the Christian Democratic Union, the CDU, the center-right political party that becomes one of the two dominant forces in West German politics. He serves in the Abgeordnetenhaus of Berlin, the West Berlin Parliament, for 20 years, from 1959 to 1979. He becomes, in other words, a pillar of the democratic West German political establishment. He raises a family. He has a wife named Gertrude and 3 children. He lives in Berlin, the same city where his photograph was published as Nazi propaganda, until his death on September 28, 2004. He is 84 years old. His story does not end with liberation. It continues through decades of ordinary life in a country rebuilding itself from the ruins of the regime that had simultaneously used his face and classified him as racially inferior. Whether he speaks publicly about his wartime experience, whether he processes it or suppresses it or integrates it into the political identity he builds in the CDU, the historical record does not capture in full detail. What it captures is the photograph, the service record, the political career, and the death at 84 in the city where all of it began. The photograph has a strange afterlife. In 2015, more than 70 years after it was taken, more than a decade after Werner Goldberg's death, the image is used in Russia for a monument in the city of Tobolsk, honoring what the monument calls protectors of the motherland. The Russian monument designers used the photograph of a Wehrmacht soldier who was half Jewish as a surrogate image for a Red Army soldier protecting the Soviet Union. The error is reported in the press when someone notices it. The photograph that the Nazi press published as the ideal German soldier ends up on a Russian monument honoring Soviet defenders. Werner Goldberg's face travels across a century and across enemy lines simultaneously. The Goldberg case is the most photographically documented individual story among the 150,000. But it is representative of a pattern that repeats across hundreds of cases in the historical record. And the pattern is this: men who are classified as racially impure by the state, who serve the state in uniform, who in some cases become the public face of the state's military apparatus, and who then live out the rest of their lives carrying the weight of that combination. The weight is not simple guilt. It is not simple victimhood. It is something harder to name. The experience of having been inside a system so contradictory that your own existence inside it was a refutation of the system's stated principles, and yet the system continued to function regardless. The Michelin company that employs Werner before the war, the clothing firm Schneller und Schmieder, jointly owned by a Jew and a non-Jew, is exactly the kind of mixed institution the Nuremberg laws are designed to eliminate. It employs Jews and Mischlinge working alongside each other in a German city. It is the kind of social reality that Nazi racial ideology says should not exist. It exists anyway. Werner works there, his colleagues are there. The ideology and the human reality of daily life exist in parallel, neither fully defeating the other, until the mechanisms of persecution become direct and physical enough that daily life can no longer absorb them. The photo itself, Der ideale deutsche Soldat, sits in this same space. The propaganda and the human reality exist simultaneously in the same image. The regime publishes it because it serves the propaganda. The regime also classifies its subject as a first-degree Mischling because the racial laws say he must be. Both things are true at the same time, inside the same system, without resolution. This is the texture of the history that the Goldberg case makes visible. Not a clean story of perpetrators and victims. Not a story where the categories hold. A story where the categories keep failing to describe the actual human beings inside them, while the machinery that enforces the categories continues to grind forward regardless. The machinery grinds most visibly and most decisively on January 20th, 1942, at a villa on a lake in the western suburbs of Berlin. But the Wannsee Conference does not settle the fate of men like Goldberg, as the subsequent years of shifting, contradictory policy make clear. What settles, or fails to settle, their fate is the accumulation of individual moments. The review board that goes one way or another, the officer who chooses to enforce a directive or to ignore it, the patron who intervenes or the patron who does not, the war ending before the paperwork catches up, The colonel who faces dismissal in September 1944 because Himmler's office writes a letter represents one endpoint of this process. The moment when the machinery finally catches an individual man it has been circling for years. But he is one case among thousands. And the broader story of what happens to Mischlinge soldiers as the war ends and the regime collapses is a story not about a single dramatic moment, but about the long, fractured aftermath of serving an institution that never decided whether to protect you or destroy you. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That aftermath, the post-war lives of the men who survive, the reparations they are denied, the communities that reject them, the identities they are left holding when the uniform comes off, is where the full weight of what the Nazi racial state did to these men becomes most completely visible. Because the persecution does not end in 1945. For many of them, in different forms, it is only beginning. Section 7. The colonel who was targeted by Himmler on September 15, 1944. 9 years to the day after Hitler stood at the Nuremberg rally and announced the laws that classified men like Ernst Bloch as racially impure. Germany is being compressed from every direction. In the West, Allied forces have liberated Paris, crossed into Belgium, and are pushing toward the German border. In the East, the Red Army has driven deep into Poland and is massing for the next phase of operations. The Wehrmacht is fighting on multiple fronts simultaneously, bleeding through experienced officers and trained soldiers at a rate the replacement system cannot match. The German war economy is being bombed around the clock by American and British air forces. Fuel is running short. Ammunition is running short. Men are running short. On this particular day, in this particular context, an officer in the headquarters of SS Chief Heinrich Himmler sits down and writes a letter. The letter is addressed to General Major Wilhelm Burgdorf, Deputy Chief of the Wehrmacht Personnel Office. Its subject is Colonel Ernst Bloch. Its demand is simple. Dismiss Bloch from the army immediately on Himmler's personal orders. The reason given is not battlefield failure. It is not insubordination. It is not any military deficiency of any kind. The reason is that Ernst Bloch is a Mischling. His father is Jewish, and Himmler wants him out. The letter is documented in Brian Mark Riggs' research, the same body of scholarship that produces Hitler's Jewish Soldiers and Lives of Hitler's Jewish Soldiers, based on more than 400 interviews and extensive archival work. Riggs cites it in the Warfare History Network article drawn from his research as a precise illustration of how the late war persecution of Mischlinge soldiers actually operated. Not through mass deportation orders or sweeping directives alone, but through individual targeting, bureaucratic processing, the methodical identification and removal of specific men by name. Ernst Bloch has survived years inside the Wehrmacht's shifting policy environment. He has navigated the periodic directives calling for the dismissal of half-Jews. He has survived the September 1942 OKH directive, demanding the removal of all remaining half-Jews from service. He has survived whatever review boards and racial audits his case has been processed through over the course of the war. By September 1944, he is a colonel, a senior officer with a substantial military record. He has been useful enough, or protected enough, or simply overlooked enough to still be in uniform 5 years after the war began. Now Himmler's office is writing letters about him. The specific outcome of Bloch's case in the final months of the war is not fully established in the public historical record. What is established is the moment itself. The machinery still running, still generating paperwork, still processing individual Jews and half-Jews for removal from institutions in September 1944, when the war has approximately 8 months left and Germany's defeat is visible to anyone willing to look at a map. The Bloch case does not exist in isolation. It exists as one data point inside a larger pattern that becomes increasingly visible as the war turns against Germany in 1943 and 1944. A pattern in which the racial persecution of Mischlinge soldiers intensifies precisely when military logic would argue most strongly for leaving them alone. This is the thing about the Nazi racial state that conventional military logic cannot fully account for. A purely military institution, fighting for survival with diminishing resources, would not spend administrative energy in September 1944 processing the removal of an experienced colonel because his father was Jewish. A purely military institution would keep every trained officer it has. But the Nazi state is not a purely military institution. It is a racial state that happens to have a military, and the racial priorities do not simply switch off when the military situation becomes desperate. In some respects, they intensify, as if the approaching collapse generates pressure to complete the racial program before time runs out. Bloch's story has a second dimension that makes it more than just a case study in late-war persecution. Earlier in the war, the exact timing is documented in Riggs' research, though the specific date is not established in the publicly available summaries. Bloch is connected to one of the most unusual rescue operations of the entire conflict. In 1940, the Lubavitcher Rebbe, Rabbi Joseph Isaac Schneersohn, the sixth leader of the Chabad Lubavitch Hasidic movement, is trapped in Warsaw. He is one of the most prominent Jewish religious leaders in the world. The city is under German occupation. His situation is desperate. A rescue operation is organized that involves a remarkable combination of actors: American diplomatic pressure, German military officers, and the specific intervention of men inside the Wehrmacht who are willing to use their positions to move a Jewish religious leader out of occupied Poland. Ernst Bloch is among the Wehrmacht officers involved in this operation. The details of the rescue, how it is organized, who gives what orders, how the Rebbe is moved from Warsaw through Germany and eventually to the United States, are documented in Riggs' second book, Rescued from the Reich. How one of Hitler's soldiers saved the Lubavitcher Rebbe, published in 2004. The book draws on archival sources and interviews to reconstruct an operation in which German military officers of partial Jewish ancestry use their institutional positions to save a Jewish religious leader from the occupied territory that those same German military forces control. The Bloch case, a man who helps rescue a Jewish Rebbe from Warsaw in 1940 and who is targeted for dismissal by Himmler's office in September 1944, contains within it almost the entire range of the Mischling soldier's experience. The protection that military rank offers in the early years of the war, the uses to which some men put that protection, the gradual tightening of the regime's grip, the moment, arriving sooner or later for almost all of them, when the uniform stops being sufficient. Other cases from the same period illuminate different facets of the same process. The Yad Vashem Studies article on Wehrmacht propaganda troops and the Jews documents the case of Werner Jörg Lüdecke, a German military correspondent serving in the Navy Propaganda Department West. Lüdecke is considered by his superiors a superb journalist. He is the head of the press section in his unit. In an act that speaks to the kind of extraordinary initiative some Wehrmacht personnel demonstrated during the war, Lüdecke spends 9 months on a round-the-world voyage on a ship attempting to break the Allied naval blockade on Germany and sail to Japan. He returns to Germany in August 1942. Shortly after his return, it becomes known that Lüdecke is a second-degree Mischling, a quartered Jew. In Nazi terminology, his case is considered significant enough, given his reputation as an outstanding soldier, to be brought directly to Hitler's attention for personal adjudication. The same mechanism used in the high-ranking officer cases, the same process by which Erhard Milch's case was managed at the top of the military hierarchy. What Hitler decides about Lüdecke is not recorded in the publicly available summaries of the Yad Vashem article. What is recorded is that Lüdecke survives the war without further persecution. His prior military reputation and the personal adjudication process together produce an outcome that spares him. The article also documents the case of General Kurt Sentner, a Mischling serving in the Wehrmacht's propaganda department. General von Wedel, Sentner's superior, states that he has no interest in having a Mischling serving in the OKW, the Wehrmacht High Command, and that Sentner should be sent back to his original unit. Von Wedel's position is clear. He wants Sentner gone, not because the rules require it, but because he personally chooses to conform to Nazi racial ideology. The dismissal from the propaganda department is not the end of Sentner's Wehrmacht career, however, because another senior officer who knows him intervenes and finds him a position in the Wehrmacht education department. This is the texture of how the system actually works at the individual level. Not a single uniform policy applied consistently across all cases. A patchwork of personal decisions. This officer enforces the racial rules strictly. That officer looks the other way. This patron intervenes. That one does not. Whether a Michelin soldier survives his service with his record and his life intact depends enormously on which specific officers he encounters and what choices those officers make. The Michelin soldier who encounters a von Wedel, an officer who chooses to enforce racial ideology even when not formally required to, has a very different experience from the Michelin soldier who encounters an officer willing to use his own authority to protect a man he considers a good soldier. Neither outcome is determined by law alone. Both are determined by the intersection of law and individual human decision. This patchwork quality of the persecution is one of the things that makes the history of Michelin soldiers so difficult to summarize. There is no single story. There is a range of outcomes shaped by rank, by record, by patronage, by luck, by timing, and by the specific human beings a man encounters at the critical moments of his service. What is consistent across the range of outcomes is the direction of the pressure. From 1935 onward, the pressure moves in one direction only, toward more restriction, more exclusion, more exposure. The half-Jews who are protected in 1939 are less protected in 1941. The ones who survived 1941 face new threats in 1942 and 1943. The ones who are still in uniform in 1944 are being targeted by letters from Himmler's office. The direction never reverses. The space keeps getting smaller. The men who understand this, and the documented testimonies suggest that many of them understand it, even if they cannot predict the specific form the next tightening will take, live with a specific kind of dread that is different from ordinary wartime fear. Ordinary wartime fear is about the enemy. This fear is about the state you are fighting for. It is the knowledge that the institution issuing your orders is also the institution that classifies you as racially inferior, that has been debating since 1935 what to do with you, and that has not yet fully decided. Some men respond to this dread by doubling down on their military performance, seeking decorations, demonstrating courage in ways that are documented and verifiable, building a record that might function as protection. The logic is the same one identified throughout Riggs' research. The Iron Cross as an argument to present to a review board. The battlefield citation as evidence of Germanness. Some men respond by seeking formal exemptions through official channels, applications to be reclassified, petitions for German blood certificates, requests for the kind of personal adjudication that Lüdecker receives. Some of these applications succeed. Many do not. Some men simply serve and wait and hope that the war ends before the machinery catches up with them specifically. For the majority of Michelin soldiers in Germany, because of the October 1943 agreement not to deport German Michelin during the war, and because the war does end before full implementation of any final policy, this calculation turns out to be correct. The war ends first. But the war ending does not mean the persecution ends cleanly. It does not mean the suffering ends. For the tens of thousands of Michelinge who are discharged from the Wehrmacht in the final years and months of the war and transferred to Organisation Todt forced labor units, the armistice in May 1945 comes as liberation from conditions that have been deteriorating steadily since they arrived. For the men whose Jewish relatives have been murdered in the camps, relatives they sometimes knew were being deported and could do nothing to help, May 1945 brings not celebration but the beginning of grief. And for all of them, the world they walk back into is a world that does not know what they are. They are not the Jewish survivors emerging from the camps whose suffering is visible, documented, and recognized. They are not the German veterans who can claim they were simply soldiers doing their duty. They are something the post-war world has no category for. Men who were persecuted by a racial state while serving in the army of that same state, whose partial Jewish ancestry made them targets, but whose military service complicated any claim to victim status in the eyes of the communities that might otherwise have embraced them. The reckoning that follows, The question of reparations, of recognition, of where these men fit in the memory of the Holocaust and the memory of the war, is one that takes decades to even partially resolve. Some of it, in formal legal and institutional terms, is not resolved until the 1990s. Some of it is never resolved at all. What happens when the men who survive try to rebuild their lives, reclaim their identities, and find their place in a Germany and a Jewish world that have both been shattered and remade by the same catastrophe? That is the final chapter of this story, and it is not a simple one. Section 8. The tightening noose. Dismissals, demotion, and the organization. Todt, the summer of 1944. Germany's military position is collapsing on every front simultaneously. In June, Allied forces land in Normandy and begin the liberation of Western Europe. In the east, Operation Bagration, the Soviet summer offensive, destroys Army Group Center in what military historians consider one of the most catastrophic defeats in the history of warfare. Hundreds of thousands of German soldiers are killed, captured, or encircled in the span of weeks. The Wehrmacht loses more men in June and July 1944 than in almost any comparable period of the entire war. In this context, the regime begins conscripting between 10,000 and 20,000 half-Jews and persons related to Jews by marriage into special units of the organization Todt. The organization Todt is a civil and military engineering organization founded by Fritz Todt in the late 1930s and named after him. It builds the Autobahn. It builds the West Wall, the line of fortifications Germany constructs opposite the French Maginot Line. It builds the Atlantic Wall along the occupied coasts of France, the Netherlands, Belgium, Denmark, and Norway. It builds roads, bridges, military installations, and underground factories across the entire territory that the German military controls. From 1938 onward, it is one of the largest employers of forced labor in the German war economy. By the time the Mischlinge are being conscripted into its units in late 1944, the organization Todt has already killed more than 185,000 forced laborers on its construction projects. The Wikipedia article on the organization Todt documents this figure directly. The Mischlinge arriving in organization Todt units in 1944 are not arriving as free workers. They are not volunteers. The Wikipedia article on the organization Todt records clearly that beginning in the autumn of 1944, between 10,000 and 20,000 half-Jews and persons related to Jews by marriage are recruited into special units. The word recruited carries none of its ordinary meaning here. These men have been discharged from the Wehrmacht, stripped of the uniform that gave them whatever institutional protection they had, and conscripted into a forced labor system. The academic study documented on academia.edu, based on survivor testimonies and camp records, identifies more than 100 forced labor camps for Mischlinge and Jews in mixed marriages operated by the organization Todt in 1944 and 1945. The total population of Mischlinge and Jews in mixed marriages across these camps exceeds 20,000 people. The camps are located in France and across the Reich itself. The study describes the variable conditions across different camp locations. Some inmates face malnutrition. Some face harsh physical treatment from guards. Nearly all face a strict prohibition on leaving the campgrounds and severe restrictions on correspondence with family members outside. These conditions are meaningfully different from the concentration camp system. The organization Todt camps are not extermination facilities. People are not being gassed in them. The intent of the regime toward the Mischlinge in these camps, as documented by the October 1943 agreement between the Ministry of Justice and the SS not to deport German Mischlinge during the war, is labor extraction rather than immediate annihilation. This distinction saves lives. It does not make the camps humane, and it does not mean the regime has decided to spare these men in any permanent or principled sense. It means the bureaucracy has agreed, for the time being, to use them rather than kill them. The deterioration in the treatment of Mischlinge soldiers across the war years follows a specific and documented trajectory, and understanding it requires going back before 1944 to trace how the tightening actually happens. In 1939, when the war begins, The conscription of Mischlinge into the Wehrmacht proceeds according to the 1936 military service law. First-degree and second-degree Mischlinge are called up alongside their Aryan counterparts. They go to Poland. The campaign is swift. The Wehrmacht's racial sorting mechanisms are not yet fully operational in the context of active war. Men are needed. They serve. The first systematic pressure begins in 1940 and 1941. Half-Jews are prohibited from promotion to non-commissioned officer rank, a restriction that has been in place since 1936. And this restriction begins to be applied more consistently. Some Mischlinge officers who slipped through before the rules were tightened find themselves facing pressure to accept demotion or discharge. Individual commands begin processing racial reviews of their personnel, identifying men whose ancestry has not previously been formally evaluated. In September 1942, the OKH issues the directive calling for the dismissal of all remaining half-Jews from the Wehrmacht. This is not the first such directive, and it is not the last. The Wikipedia article on German Jewish military personnel documents the pattern clearly. The same month this dismissal directive goes out, 118 Mischlinge soldiers and their wives are declared German, and 258 others are declared eligible for promotion to officer rank. The system produces contradictory outcomes simultaneously because the competing pressures, racial ideology versus military need, have not been resolved. The Battle of Stalingrad ends in February 1943 with the surrender of the German Sixth Army. More than 300,000 German soldiers are killed or captured in the campaign. It is the turning point of the war on the Eastern Front, and arguably of the entire conflict. The regime's response to this catastrophe includes, counterintuitively, an intensification of its racial policies rather than a moderation of them. In 1943, the OKH begins developing proposals for using previously excluded Mischlinge in construction labor battalions. The specific language preserved in the documentary record describes deployment in especially unhealthy swamps. This is not a description of ordinary construction work. It is a description of conditions specifically chosen for their capacity to damage or destroy the health of the men assigned to them. The regime is proposing to use the Mischlinge as a labor resource to be consumed in conditions designed to be lethal by attrition. These proposals do not immediately result in mass transfers. The bureaucratic arguments about what to do with Mischlinge soldiers continue through 1943. The October 1943 agreement not to deport German Mischlinge during the war is reached. But the agreement does not protect these men from being transferred to the organization Todt. It only means they are not being sent to the extermination camps. The distinction, from the perspective of a man standing inside an organization Todt labor camp in France in 1944, is real but limited. The academic study on forced labor camps for Mischlinge documents one detail that carries particular weight. In at least one camp, Mittitzreutschen, former Wehrmacht soldiers request permission to wear their military decorations while performing forced labor. The Iron Cross, the Eastern Front Medal, whatever commendations they have earned in years of combat service. They want to wear these objects in a labor camp. The request is not primarily about pride. It is a survival strategy. The same study documents that previous service in the Wehrmacht leads to better treatment for some Mischlinge in these camps. Guards and administrators who might otherwise be indifferent or hostile to inmates respond differently to a man displaying a decoration that certifies his service to Germany. The men who have spent years seeking medals as protection against racial review are now presenting those same medals to Organization Todt camp guards as evidence that they deserve to be treated as something more than slave labor. The Iron Cross that was supposed to protect them from the racial laws is now being used to negotiate fractionally better conditions inside the system those same laws have delivered them into. The Organization Todt camp system exists in a legal and institutional space distinct from both the Wehrmacht and the SS concentration camp network. The Wikipedia article on the Organization Todt notes that all members of the Organization Todt, even forced laborers, are regarded as Wehrmachtsgefolge, that is, as persons accompanying the armed forces, with the exception of Jews. This classification matters in terms of legal standing under the laws of war. Mischlinge in Organization Todt units are not classified as Jews in this framework. They are in the camp because of their partial Jewish ancestry, doing forced labor under coercive conditions. But they exist in a bureaucratic category that keeps them formally distinct from the Jewish forced laborers and concentration camp inmates further down the regime's hierarchy of persecution. This distinction, fragile and contingent as it is what the October 1943 agreement produces in practical terms. Not safety, not freedom. A slightly higher position in a graduated system of destruction. The individual cases that survive in the documentary record give this abstract framework human texture. The case of Colonel Ernst Bloch, targeted by Himmler's office in September 1944, represents the upper end of the rank scale. A senior officer with years of service and documented military contributions being pursued for dismissal because of his ancestry. Bloch's connection to the rescue of the Lubavitcher Rebbe earlier in the war, documented in Riggs' research, shows that some Mishlinga officers used their institutional positions actively to help Jewish victims during the years when they still had access and authority. The tightening of the regime's grip around men like Bloch is therefore not just a story about their own persecution. It is also a story about the progressive elimination of the small number of people inside the German military who had both the motivation and the capacity to intervene on behalf of Jews in danger. As Mishlinga soldiers are discharged and transferred to organization-taught units, that capacity disappears entirely. A man performing forced labor in a camp in France has no institutional authority to intervene in anything. He cannot write letters on anyone's behalf. He cannot issue orders. He cannot move a person from one list to another. Whatever he could do as an officer in the Wehrmacht, he cannot do as a forced laborer in the organization taught. The documentary record from the organization taught camps, as the Academia.edu study notes, includes evidence of families and former employers attempting to reclaim specific individuals. To get men released from camp conscription by demonstrating that they have essential civilian roles, or that their family circumstances require their presence outside the camp. Some of these efforts succeed. The fact that they can succeed at all reflects the ambiguous status of the Mishlinga within the system. Men who are being persecuted but who have not been stripped of all social connections and legal standing in the way that full Jews have been. They still have non-Jewish spouses, non-Jewish employers, non-Jewish neighbors who can write letters and make phone calls on their behalf. Of the approximately 15,000 Jews liberated in Germany proper after the war, the USC Shoah Foundation's documentation of research by historian Maximilian Sternad notes that about 10,000 had non-Jewish spouses. The intermarried and the Mishlinga represent a distinct subgroup within the broader population of Jewish and partially Jewish people who survived the war inside Germany. People whose survival depends partly on their continued connection to the non-Jewish social world, which gives them access to forms of intervention and protection that fully isolated Jews do not have. The organization Todd camp system begins to dissolve in the final months of the war as Germany's infrastructure collapses under Allied bombing and advancing ground forces. Camps are evacuated. Prisoners are moved. The administrative machinery that has been running the whole operation begins to break down as the regime itself breaks down. For the Mishlinga in these camps, the end of the war arrives not as a dramatic liberation, but as a gradual dissolution of the system that has been controlling their lives. The guards stop showing up, the administrative machinery stops functioning, the fences stop meaning anything. May 1945. Germany surrenders. The organization Todd camps empty out. The forced laborers, including the Mishlinga, who spent the final year of the war performing construction work under coercive conditions, return to whatever is left of their lives. What they return to is not a recognizable world. The cities are bombed. The social structures they grew up in have been destroyed. The Jewish relatives some of them were protecting through their military service are, in many cases, dead. Murdered in the camps while these men were wearing German uniforms or swinging picks in organization-taught construction sites. The non-Jewish families they belong to are facing their own reckonings with what Germany did and what Germany lost. And the men themselves are carrying something that the post-war world has no established framework for processing. They are not perpetrators in any simple sense. They are not victims in any recognized sense. They served in the army of the state that persecuted their relatives. They were persecuted by that same state. They wore its uniform and dug its ditches, and some of them fought in its campaigns, and some of them used their positions to help the people that state was trying to kill. The world they walk back into in May 1945 is a world sorting itself into categories: perpetrators, victims, bystanders, resistors. None of those categories fit what these men are, and the institutions that might have helped them find a place, the Jewish community that has survived, the German state that is being rebuilt, the international legal framework being assembled at Nuremberg, are all struggling with questions so large that the specific question of the Mischling soldier barely registers. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. What happens to these men when they try to claim a place in the post-war world? When they approach the Jewish community and find themselves rejected? When they apply for reparations and are turned away? When they discover that the identity the Nazi state imposed on them has followed them past the end of the regime that created it, is the final and perhaps the most painful chapter of the story. Section 9. The Colonel Who Faces Dismissal. What happened to individual men? The war ends on May 8, 1945. The guns stop. The camps open. The machinery of the Nazi state shuts down. And somewhere in the rubble of Germany, tens of thousands of men who spent the war years in Wehrmacht uniforms or organization-taught labor camps or the narrow space between those two institutions begin the process of figuring out what their lives are now. They are not a coherent group. They never were. They were never organized, never collectively represented, never formally acknowledged as a category by any institution that had their interests in mind. The Nuremberg laws created the category of Mischling, and the Wehrmacht conscripted it, but no organization existed to advocate for the men inside that category, to document their experiences, to prepare them for what would follow. They come out of the war as individuals, carrying individual histories, facing individual versions of the same set of impossible questions. What are you? The question is not rhetorical. It is practical and immediate. In a post-war Germany being administered by Allied occupation authorities, your legal status matters. It determines what rations you receive, what housing you qualify for, what restitution programs you can access, how you are processed through the denazification system. And for Mischlinge veterans, the answer to the question of what you are is genuinely unclear in ways that produce real material consequences. Consider the specific situation of a first-degree Mischling, a half-Jew who has served in the Wehrmacht from 1939 to 1944, been discharged under the racial policies, spent the final year of the war in an organization-taught labor camp, and emerged in May 1945 into a German city that has been partially destroyed by Allied bombing. Is this man a Holocaust survivor? The Nazi racial state classified him as racially impure. He was persecuted. He was stripped of career opportunities, subjected to racial reviews, discharged from the military under racial laws, and conscripted into forced labor. His Jewish relatives, his father, his grandparents, his cousins, may have been murdered in the camps. Is he a German veteran? He served in the Wehrmacht. He wore the uniform. He fought in campaigns. He may have earned decorations. Is he a victim of Nazism entitled to restitution? Or is his military service a complicating factor that places him outside the recognized categories of victimhood? The post-war legal and institutional framework does not have clean answers to these questions. What it has is a set of categories drawn up to address the most visible and numerically largest populations: the Jewish survivors of the camps, the non-Jewish German population going through denazification, the displaced persons awaiting resettlement. The Mischlinge do not fit neatly into any of these categories, and the institutions handling each category do not have particular motivation to expand their definitions to include them. The result, documented across multiple historical sources, is that many Mischlinge are excluded from reparations programs because they are not classified as full Jews. The Consider the Source educational resource, drawing on Holocaust scholarship including the work of Michael Berenbaum, documents this directly. After the war, many Mischlinge struggled with identity and survivor status, and some were excluded from reparations because they were not classified as full Jews. The reparations question is not a minor administrative detail. It is a question about whether the German state, in its post-war form, acknowledges that what happened to these men was persecution and that they are owed something for it. The answer, in many cases, is no. Not because no persecution occurred. It clearly did. But because the legal definitions of who counts as a victim are drawn around full Jews, and the men who fall outside that definition fall outside the compensation programs. This exclusion compounds an injury that is already enormous. These men have spent the war years watching their Jewish relatives be deported and murdered while wearing the uniform of the state doing the murdering. Some of them knew what was happening and could do nothing. Some of them used whatever institutional access they had to try to help. Moves documented in individual cases like Ernst Bloch's involvement in the rescue of the Lubavitcher Rebbe, or the various smaller interventions that Rig documents across his interview subjects. Some did not know the full extent of what was happening until the camps were liberated and the scale of the murder became undeniable. In all cases, May 1945 brings not relief but grief. The relatives they were trying to protect are gone. The uniform that was supposed to be a shield has been stripped away. The state that issued the uniform is dissolved. What remains is the loss. Researcher Brian Mark Rigg, who interviews more than 400 Mischlinge and their relatives in the 1990s, finds a consistent pattern in how these men relate to their wartime experience in the decades after the war. Most of them do not speak about it. Not to their children, not to their neighbors, not in public forums. The silence is not accidental. It is a response to a social environment that gives them nowhere to speak from. If they speak as German veterans, they are associated with the Wehrmacht and its crimes. The post-war reckoning with what the German military did in occupied Europe, the massacres, the complicity in the Holocaust, the brutal treatment of Soviet prisoners of war, makes identification as a Wehrmacht veteran complicated and in many contexts shameful. These men served in that institution. Whatever their personal actions, the institution's record is what it is. If they speak as Jewish victims, they face rejection from the Jewish community itself. The H-Net academic review of Rigg's lives of Hitler's Jewish soldiers documents this explicitly. Mischlinge who survived were later often rejected by the Jewish community because of their service in the German armed forces. The community that has just emerged from the most catastrophic event in Jewish history. A community that has lost 1/3 of its global population, that is processing unimaginable collective grief and trauma, does not have unlimited capacity for nuance. A man who wore a Wehrmacht uniform is, from within the perspective of that grief, a man who wore the uniform of the killers. The internal complexity of his situation, the compulsion that put him in that uniform, the relatives he was trying to protect by wearing it, these things require a level of patient attention that the immediate post-war period does not supply. The PMC Journal article on intermarried families in Vienna, based on oral history interviews conducted in the late 1990s and early 2000s, documents this dynamic from the perspective of the families themselves. After the war, intermarried families and their Mischling children are considered by other survivors as people to whom nothing had happened. People who had been able to remain in Vienna, seemingly unscathed, while everyone else was being deported. This perception is not accurate. These families experienced discrimination, persecution, forced labor, the destruction of their career prospects and social standing, and in many cases the murder of their Jewish relatives. But from the outside, from the perspective of people who survived the camps, the Mischling experience registers as minimal. Not real suffering, not real victimhood, just survival. The impact of this perception on the self-understanding of Mischling survivors is documented in the same study. While processing the facts of the Holocaust and what their Jewish relatives had endured, survivors from intermarried families find that their own experience of discrimination and persecution suddenly seems insignificant by comparison. They internalize the external judgment. They minimize what happened to them. Some stop speaking about it entirely. The PMC article also documents that children of intermarried families in Austria are not formally acknowledged as victims of National Socialism until the late 1990s, more than 50 years after the end of the war. For those who, as Mischlinge, did not have to wear the yellow star, formal recognition of their persecution comes only in the final years of the 20th century. The Werner Goldberg case illustrates one possible post-war trajectory. Goldberg moves into West German politics. He joins the CDU. He serves in the West Berlin parliament for 20 years. He builds a public life in the democratic West German state, representing a constituency, participating in the political institutions of a rebuilt Germany. His Mischling status and his wartime experience are documented and eventually become historical material. But they do not define his public identity in the way that his photograph defines his historical one. He lives to 84. He has a family. He survives, in every sense. But Goldberg's trajectory, integration into post-war West German public life, a stable career, a normal lifespan, is not universal among his cohort. The identity crisis that Rigg documents across his interview subjects does not simply dissolve when the war ends. It persists. These men were told by the Nazi state that they were not German enough. They were told by the post-war Jewish community that they were not Jewish enough. They were told by the post-war German state that they were not victimized enough to qualify for reparations. They exist in a space between all recognized categories, and that space does not become more comfortable with time. Most of the men Rigg interviews in the 1990s are, by that point, elderly. They are in their 60s, 70s, 80s. Many have spent 50 years not talking about what happened to them. The interviews Rigg conducts are, for some of them, the first time they have told their stories in full to anyone outside their immediate families. Some have never told their families. 2 of the men in his research become pastors after the war, an act that carries its own significance, a movement toward an institution and an identity that the Nazi state could not classify racially, in a world where racial classification had defined and deformed their entire early lives. The H-Net review of Rigg's research notes that after the war, most of the men were either non-religious, Christian, or otherwise distanced from any Jewish identification. This is not surprising given that most of them had been raised Christian and had never identified as Jewish. What is notable is the distancing from Jewish identification that occurs specifically after the war, an active movement away from the identity that the Nazi state had imposed on them, even in the absence of any strong Jewish identity to begin with. The category of Mischling was a wound. The post-war years do not close it. They reopen it in different ways. The Notgemeinschaft der durch die Nürnberger Gesetze Betroffenen, the emergency association of those affected by the Nuremberg laws, is founded after the war by Mischlinge survivors. The Wikipedia article on Mischling notes that this organization still exists. It represents one organized response to the collective experience of being persecuted by laws that targeted partial Jewish ancestry. An attempt by the people affected to create the institutional recognition that the post-war state does not spontaneously provide. The organization's existence is significant not just as a practical matter, but as a statement. The people affected by the Nuremberg laws are not simply subsumed into the broader categories of Holocaust survivor or German veteran. They have a specific experience defined by a specific set of laws, and they create an institution to hold and represent that specific experience. The Wannsee debate, Heydrich wanting deportation, Stuttgart proposing sterilization, the October 1943 agreement not to deport during the war, turns out, in retrospect, to have been the bureaucratic mechanism that keeps most Mischlinge in Germany alive. Not mercy, not principle. Administrative disagreement and the intervention of the Justice Ministry to postpone a decision that the SS never gets the chance to implement before the war ends. The men who survive do so because the bureaucracy fails to reach consensus in time. The fragility of that survival? The understanding that a slightly different outcome at any of the key bureaucratic decision points would have meant deportation and death is part of what the survivors carry. They know how close it came. They know that the protection they had was not a right. It was a contingency. It could have gone differently. For the Jews on the other side of the Nuremberg classification line, the full Jews, the 3 and 4 grandparent Jews. It did go differently. Millions of them are dead. The Mischling soldier who survives lives with this knowledge. He survives because a bureaucratic compromise was reached in October 1943. His cousin, classified as a full Jew, does not survive because no such compromise was reached for her. The line between the two is 2 grandparents, a number on a chart, a box on a teaching poster distributed to German officials in 1936. This is what the Nazi racial classification system produces in human terms at the far end of its logic. Not clean categories, not a coherent account of who deserved what. A distribution of outcomes determined by a pseudoscientific chart that the regime itself contradicted whenever it chose to, producing survivors who cannot fully claim their survival and dead who cannot be claimed back. The Erhard Milch case, the field marshal convicted at Nuremberg, the man whose mother declared herself an adulterer to protect his career, represents the most extreme version of the post-war reckoning. His German blood certificate, signed by Hitler, does not protect him from the judgment of the American military tribunal. He is convicted for what he did with the power his survival gave him. The forced labor system, the concentration camp inmates in the aircraft factories, the 40,000 Soviet prisoners of war requisitioned for engine production. The racial exemption that saved him from persecution delivers him into the hands of prosecutors with the evidence of his crimes intact. Quote, _8, the other 149,999 men in the 150,000 do not face Nuremberg prosecutors. They face something quieter and in some ways harder. The daily work of living in a world that does not know what to do with them, in bodies that carry the memory of what they did and what was done to them, in a silence that many of them will maintain until the researchers and the documentarians and the historians finally start asking questions 50 years after the fact. Section 10. After the War. Rejected by both sides, May 1945. The Reich is gone. What replaces it is rubble, occupation zones, and a silence so thick it will take decades to fully break. Germany is divided into 4 Allied occupation sectors. The cities are bombed out. The infrastructure is destroyed. The population is in shock. Some of it genuinely, some of it performatively, some of it in the specific way that people who participated in atrocity enter shock when the atrocity stops being profitable and starts being prosecuted. Into this landscape walk the Mischlinge, tens of thousands of them. Men who have spent between 2 and 6 years in Wehrmacht uniforms, or organization taught labor camps, or the narrow administrative space between those 2 institutions. Men who have lost Jewish relatives to the camps. Men who were never fully accepted by the state they fought for and never fully protected by the racial category they were assigned to. Men who are now in the ruins of the regime that classified them, trying to figure out what they are. The question of identity is not abstract for these men. It is not a philosophical exercise. It determines everything practical about their immediate lives. What housing they qualify for, what food rations they receive, what restitution programs they can access, how they are processed through the Allied denazification system, whether they are treated as victims or perpetrators or something in between. And the answer the post-war world gives them, across multiple institutional frameworks, is consistent in its own way. It is, you do not fit here. Start with the Jewish community. The Jewish community that survives the war is a community in catastrophe. Before the war, approximately 9 million Jews lived in Europe. By 1945, approximately 6 million of them have been murdered. The communities of Poland, the Baltic states, Ukraine, Hungary, and Germany itself have been almost entirely destroyed. The survivors who emerge from the camps are physically devastated, starved, diseased, psychologically shattered by experiences that have no precedent in recorded history. The Jewish world has lost 1/3 of its global population in less than 6 years. This community is not in a position to engage patiently with complexity. It is in a position of raw, unprocessed grief and rage. And when Mischlinge veterans approach it, men who served in Wehrmacht uniform, who fought in campaigns that occupied the countries where the murders happened, who wore the insignia of the institution that made the Holocaust logistically possible, the response is frequently rejection. The H-Net academic review of Brian Mark Riggs' Lives of Hitler's Jewish Soldiers documents this directly and without softening. Mischlinge who survived were later often rejected by the Jewish community because of their service in the German armed forces. The uniform is what the community sees. The compulsion that produced the uniform, the relatives the uniform was supposed to protect, the internal suffering of the man wearing it. These things are not visible from the outside. What is visible is the eagle and the swastika on the sleeve. The rejection is not universal. Individual relationships survive, families reconnect, personal histories override institutional responses in specific cases. But as a general pattern, as the experience of approaching Jewish communal institutions, Jewish survivor organizations, Jewish religious communities in the post-war years, the Mischlinge veteran encounters a door that does not open easily or fully. The publisher's weekly review of Riggs Hitler's Jewish Soldiers notes that some Mischlinge perished in the camps, and that those who survived were later often rejected by the Jewish community because of their service in the German armed forces. This is not a peripheral observation. It is a central fact of the post-war experience of this population. The persecution they endured under the Nazi state is followed immediately by a second form of exclusion. Not violent, not state-sponsored, but real and painful. From the community whose suffering their partial ancestry nominally connects them to. The German side of the ledger is no simpler. The post-war German state, first the occupation administration, then the Federal Republic established in West Germany in 1949, builds its legal framework for reparations around the category of the Jewish victim. The Bundesentschädigungsgesetz, the federal compensation law, establishes restitution programs for people who were persecuted on racial, religious, or political grounds by the Nazi state. In principle, this should cover Mischlinge. They were persecuted on racial grounds. The racial laws stripped them of career opportunities, subjected them to forced labor, discharged them from the military under racial classifications, and in many cases killed their relatives. In practice, many Mischlinge find themselves excluded from these programs because they do not meet the legal definition of a full Jewish victim. The Consider the Source educational resource, drawing on scholarship by Holocaust historian Michael Berenbaum, states this clearly. After the war, many Mischlinge struggled with identity and survivor status, and some were excluded from reparations because they were not classified as full Jews. The word some in that formulation does real work. It is not all. Some Mischlinge do receive recognition and some form of restitution, but the exclusion is widespread enough and documented enough across multiple sources to constitute a pattern rather than an exception. Berenbaum's framing of the Mischling experience as a constant negotiation between identity, survival, and erasure applies with particular force to the post-war decades. The negotiation does not end in 1945. It continues through the reparations process, through the denazification hearings, through the gradual emergence of Holocaust memory as a public and institutional phenomenon in the 1960s and beyond. As Holocaust memory becomes more organized and institutionalized, through the Eichmann trial in 1961, through the establishment of Yad Vashem and the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, through the gradual incorporation of Holocaust education into school curricula across the Western world. The Mischling experience remains largely invisible within the emerging official memory. The canonical narrative of the Holocaust centers on the full Jewish victim and the German perpetrator. The Mischling sits between those categories, belonging fully to neither, and the canonical narrative does not have a place for people who belong fully to neither. The PMC Journal article on privileged families under Nazi rule, based on oral history interviews with children of intermarried families in Vienna conducted in the late 1990s and early 2000s, documents the consequences of this invisibility with precision. After the war, Intermarried families and their Mischling children are considered by other survivors to be people to whom nothing happened, people who remained in Vienna while everyone else was being deported. The perception is that their suffering was not real suffering, not the kind that counts, not the kind that requires acknowledgement or compensation or memory. The families internalize this perception. The study documents that while learning the facts of the Holocaust, the family member's own experience of discrimination and persecution suddenly seems insignificant by comparison. They begin to minimize what happened to them. Some stop speaking about it. Their children, the second generation, grow up without the family history because the first generation does not transmit it. This silence is not unique to the Viennese cases. It is a pattern that Brian Mark Rigg documents consistently across his more than 400 interviews with Mischlinge and their relatives across Germany. Most of these men, by the time Rigg reaches them in the 1990s, are in their 60s, 70s, and 80s. Many have not spoken about their wartime experiences to anyone outside their immediate households. Some have not spoken about it to their children. Some have not spoken about it to their wives. The silence is protective. Speaking means entering a space where you will be misunderstood from at least two directions simultaneously. Speak as a victim, and the Jewish community questions your right to that identity. Speak as a German soldier, and the post-war German political culture, particularly after the 1960s, when the West German public begins a serious reckoning with the crimes of the Nazi period, looks at you with suspicion. Speak as something in between, and nobody knows what to do with you. The H-Net review of Rigg's Lives of Hitler's Jewish Soldiers identifies that after the war, most of the men Rigg interviews are either non-religious, Christian, or actively distanced from any Jewish identification. This is a significant finding. The men are distancing themselves from an identity that was imposed on them, that caused them suffering, and that the post-war world offers them no particular reason to reclaim. The Jewish community has not welcomed them. The German state has not fully compensated them. The identity of Mischling, the only identity the Nazi state had for them, is the identity of a wound, and most of them are trying to let the wound close by not touching it. Two of the men in Rigg's research become pastors after the war. The movement toward Christian ministry is interpretable in multiple ways. Genuine religious vocation, an assertion of the Christian identity the Nazi state tried to complicate, a reaching toward an institution that defines membership by faith rather than by grandparent census records. Whatever the individual motivations, the pattern is consistent with what the broader research documents: a movement away from the Mischling identity and toward whatever available identity offers the most stability and the fewest complications. The Notgemeinschaft der durch die Nürnberger Gesetze Betroffenen, the emergency association of those affected by the Nuremberg laws, represents the organized collective response to this situation. Founded by Mischlinge survivors after the war, documented in the Wikipedia article on Mischling, it still exists today. Its name is precise. Not those affected by the Holocaust, not Jewish survivors, not German victims, but those affected by the Nuremberg laws specifically. It creates an institutional identity defined by the specific legal instrument of persecution, rather than by any ethnic or religious category. It is the survivors themselves finding the only framing that accurately describes what happened to them. The Austrian case offers a specific timeline that makes the delayed recognition concrete and measurable. The PMC Journal article documents that children of intermarried families in Austria are not formally acknowledged as victims of National Socialism until the late 1990s. For those who, as Mischlinge, did not have to wear the yellow star, the visible marker of Jewish persecution that the regime imposed on full Jews from 1941 onward, formal recognition comes more than 50 years after the end of the war. 50 years. The men who were 18 years old when the Nuremberg laws were passed in 1935 are in their late 70s by the time the Austrian state formally acknowledges that what happened to them constituted persecution. The men who were conscripted into the Wehrmacht in 1939 at age 20 are in their late 50s when the Eichmann trial brings Holocaust memory into public consciousness in the early 1960s. They are in their 70s when the major institutional memorial frameworks are being established. They are in their 80s when Rig comes knocking on their doors with a tape recorder. Most of the men Rig interviews in the 1990s are near the end of their lives. Werner Goldberg, whose story begins this history in a very real sense, the photograph, the ideal German soldier caption, the irony made permanent in newsprint, dies in Berlin on September 28, 2004. He is 84 years old. He has lived through the Nazi period, the war, the division of Germany, the Cold War, and the reunification of Germany. He has served in the West Berlin Parliament. He has watched the country that published his face as a racial ideal and classified him as a racial inferior rebuild itself into a functioning democracy. Whether he ever fully reconciles those two facts, the photograph and the Michelin designation, the propaganda value and the racial impurity, the ideal soldier caption on a half-Jewish face, the historical record does not say. What it says is that he lives his life, serves his constituents, raises his family, and dies at 84 in the city where all of it started. The Erhard Milch case reaches its own conclusion within the post-war legal framework. Milch is convicted at Nuremberg in 1947 for war crimes and crimes against humanity, specifically for his central role in the forced labor system that used concentration camp inmates, Soviet prisoners of war, and Eastern European conscripts to keep the Luftwaffe's production running. He is sentenced to life imprisonment. The sentence is commuted. He is released from Landsberg prison in 1954. He lives until January 25, 1972, dying at 79 in West Germany. The German blood certificate that Hitler signed to protect him from the racial laws does not protect him from the American military tribunal. The patronage of Göring, the affidavit from his mother, the formal reclassification as a person of German blood. None of it matters in 1947 when American prosecutors present the documentation of what he did with the power his survival gave him. The racial exemption and the war crimes conviction exist in the same biography, one following from the other. The full picture of what happens to the Jews who fought for Nazi Germany is not a picture with a clean resolution. It is a picture that begins with a racial chart distributed to German officials in 1935 and ends in the 1990s with an elderly man telling a young American researcher something he has not told anyone in 50 years. In between is everything: the conscription and the volunteering, the decorations and the dismissals, the organization taught camps and the field marshal's baton, the Wannsee debate and the October 1943 agreement, the liberation and the rejection, the silence and the slow, incomplete emergence of acknowledgement. Holocaust scholar Michael Berenbaum's formulation holds across the entire span of the story. For the Mischlinge, the Holocaust was a constant negotiation between identity, survival, and erasure. The negotiation does not end when the regime that started it collapses. It continues through the decades in which the world tries to build a memory of what happened, and finds that the memory it builds does not quite have room for people who were persecuted by one system while serving inside it, who survived because a bureaucracy failed to reach consensus in time, and who spent the rest of their lives in a space between every category the post-war world offers. They are not perpetrators. They are not victims in the recognized sense. They are not bystanders. They are something the history books struggle to name, which is why it takes a researcher riding a bicycle through Germany in the early 1990s, knocking on the doors of elderly men, to bring their story into the light 50 years after the fact. The photograph of Werner Goldberg, Der ideale deutsche Soldat, the ideal German soldier, the half-Jewish face on the Nazi propaganda page, is still the image that captures it most completely. Not because it tells the whole story, because it shows the contradiction in a single frame, without explanation, without resolution. A man who is everything the regime says he should be, and everything the regime says he cannot be, simultaneously, in the same uniform, in the same photograph, in the same Germany. That Germany is gone. The men are almost all gone now, too. What remains is the number, 150,000. And the stories inside it, and the question of what it means that the regime which classified these men as racially impure needed them badly enough to put them in uniform, persecuted them badly enough to strip that uniform away, and failed definitively enough in its own logic that most of them outlived it. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.